Mississippi Delta, 1892. By the time the shooting stopped inside Hollis's saloon, 4 men were dead. The sheriff of Calico Bend was bleeding against his own bar, staring at a broken badge in the sawdust. And the man everyone had come to kill was walking calmly out the front door. What nobody in that room understood yet was how badly they had misjudged him. Because when 14 armed men surrounded that black traveling musician, they believed they were ending a story. They believed he had nothing, no allies, no protection, no chance. Just a guitar and a battered case resting beside his boot. And in Mississippi in 1892, a black musician reaching for his guitar case looked like the safest thing in the world. So nobody stopped him, nobody shouted, nobody raised a rifle. Then the first latch opened, and everything in that room changed forever. To understand how a quiet musician walked into a Mississippi town and walked out leaving 4 armed men behind him, we have to go back 3 days. Back to a place called Calico Bend, and the moment 2 travelers first realized this town had already decided how their story was supposed to end. The heat came first, not slowly, not politely, but all at once. Late July in the Mississippi Delta had a way of pressing down on a town like a heavy hand. Dust roads baked hard. Wooden buildings groaned in the sun. Men sat outside the general store pretending the heat didn't bother them, while it slowly drained the patience out of everyone in sight. Calico Bend was not much of a town. 1 road, 1 sheriff's office, 1 saloon. A few businesses that survived mostly because the nearest real town was 2 days away by mule. And like many Delta towns in 1892, Calico Bend had rules that nobody wrote down. Strangers were noticed, black strangers even more so. That afternoon, a mule appeared at the far end of the road. Nobody stood up, nobody waved, but the talking stopped, because the rider was a black man. Lean, road-worn, wearing a flat-brim hat pushed back slightly on his head. Across his back, strapped tight with leather, was a battered guitar case. Walking beside the mule was an older man, gray at the temples, quiet in the way men become quiet after spending too many years on dangerous roads. His name was Amos Fell, and Amos looked at the town once, just once. His eyes moved across the buildings, the men outside the store, the sheriff's office sitting in the middle of the street like it owned the ground beneath it. Then Amos said 4 quiet words. "This one feels wrong." The rider nodded, but he didn't turn around. His name was Malachi Boon. Somewhere in his mid-30s, though the road had written extra years across his face. He had been traveling southern roads for 6 years with 2 things that had kept him alive longer than most men expected: a guitar and the case that carried it. They stopped outside a leaning wooden building with a faded painted sign swinging above the door. Hollis's Saloon. Inside, the air smelled like whiskey, sawdust, and old arguments that never quite ended. Behind the bar stood Garrett Hollis, heavy set, sweating through his collar, watching the door with the nervous attention of a man who believed his entire life could collapse if the wrong thing happened inside his saloon. When Malachi stepped in, Hollis studied him carefully. A black traveling musician, alone in Mississippi. Most men would have sent him away, but Hollis needed something more than caution. He needed money. "You play?" Hollis asked. Malachi lifted the guitar case slightly. "That's the idea." Hollis hesitated. Then he made the decision that Calico Bend would regret for the next 30 years. 3 nights. That was the offer. 3 nights on a stool at the end of the bar, cheap pay, no arguments, and rules. Hollis spoke them quietly. Don't look at the women. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't react to anything anyone says. And one more. Finish when I tell you. Malachi listened with the calm patience of a man hearing a song he already knew. He had heard these rules in every town that had ever hired him. Different voices, same meaning. He nodded once. Yes. That night, Malachi Boon opened the guitar side of the case, lifted the instrument, and sat down on a wooden stool at the end of Hollis's bar. The room expected noise, cheap background music, something they could laugh through. Instead, the first note changed the air. Men who had been shouting went quiet. Cards stopped moving. Glasses stayed halfway to mouths. The music was not simply good. It was extraordinary. The rare kind of music that slips inside a room and rearranges it. By the second song, the saloon was fuller than it had been in months. Hollis counted money with shaking hands. And somewhere underneath the satisfaction, he felt something else begin to grow. Something uneasy. Because the room was no longer under his control. Near the back wall, Amos watched the faces instead of listening to the music. And halfway through the third song, the saloon door opened. Sheriff Denton Crow stepped inside. He took a glass of whiskey without paying. Nobody asked him to. He stood at the back of the room, watching the musician play. Not angry, not surprised, just measuring. The way a man measures distance before deciding exactly when to act. Sheriff Denton Crow did not interrupt the music. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood there, whiskey glass in his hand, watching. Amos noticed it first. Not the sheriff himself, the expression. Amos had spent 30 years traveling southern roads, and he had seen hatred on men's faces more times than he could count. Hatred was loud. Hatred moved quickly. Hatred made mistakes. This was different. This was calculation. The kind of look a man gives something he plans to deal with later. Malachi finished the song. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then the noise returned. Cards slapped the tables. Chairs scraped. Men started talking again, a little louder than before, like they were trying to prove the music had not done anything to them. Crow finished his whiskey. He set the glass down on the bar without paying. Then he turned toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back. Across the entire length of the saloon, his eyes met Malachi's. Just 1 second. No words, no gesture. Just the quiet understanding that both men now knew the other existed. Then Crow left. The door closed behind him, and the night swallowed him whole. Later, after the saloon emptied, Hollis counted his money twice. The stack of coins and bills was larger than any Tuesday night he could remember. He smiled while he counted, but it was a nervous smile, because something about the night had shifted in a way he did not entirely trust. Malachi stepped outside through the back door. The alley was dark and still hot from the day. Amos was already sitting on the wooden steps, elbows on his knees. He didn't look up when Malachi came out. He just said quietly, "We should leave before tomorrow." Malachi sat beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of Calico Bend drifted through the night. A dog barking somewhere down the road. A piano playing badly from another building. The soft creak of wood as the town settled into the heat. Finally, Malachi said, "We need the money." Amos let out a slow breath. He had heard that sentence before. In another town, 8 years earlier, from another musician. That man had also needed the money. Amos had buried him 2 days later. But Amos did not argue. He simply nodded once, because there were times when a man already knew the risk he was taking and had decided to take it anyway. The second night was hotter, not just the weather, everything. The air inside Hollis's saloon felt thicker. Word had traveled through Calico Bend faster than anyone expected. There was a black musician playing at Hollis's, and the first night, something about it had been different. So people came, more than before. Men who did not usually drink on weeknights. Younger men, louder men, the kind who laughed too hard and watched too carefully. Hollis welcomed them all. More customers meant more money. He poured drinks faster than usual, trying to ignore the tension creeping through the room. Amos did not ignore it. He stood near the side door, watching the crowd. 3 men at the back table caught his attention immediately. They were not listening to the music. They were watching Malachi. Flat expressions, patient, waiting. Malachi saw them too, but his hands never stopped moving. The music flowed out across the room again, smooth and steady, the kind of playing that made men forget their drinks. And for a while, it almost worked. Until Cutter stood up. Cutter was drunk, but not the loose, easy kind of drunk, the dangerous kind. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted across the room, "That musician's been looking at my woman." The room went silent again. It didn't matter that Malachi's eyes had not left the guitar strings. It didn't matter that Cutter's woman looked confused. What mattered was that the accusation had been made. In towns like Calico Bend, accusations didn't need proof. They only needed an audience. Malachi finished the bar he was playing. Every note. Perfect. Unhurried. Then he placed the guitar gently on the bar, both hands visible, and sat perfectly still. No apology, no anger, just silence. The controlled stillness of a man who knew the wrong movement could end his life. Hollis moved quickly. Not to defend Malachi, to protect the night's money. He hurried to Cutter, whispered something, shoved another drink into his hand. The tension loosened just enough. The moment passed. The room started breathing again. But one man was already leaving, Crow's deputy. He stood quietly, finished nothing, and walked out the door. No hurry, no explanation, just gone. Amos watched the door close behind him, and he knew exactly what that meant. The clock had started. And tomorrow night, Sheriff Denton Crow would come back. Malachi slept that night. Amos did not. He sat outside their rented room before sunrise, leaning back on a wooden chair with his shoulders against the wall. From that position, he could see the main street of Calico Bend. He watched the town wake up the way he had watched 100 towns wake up before. Quietly, carefully, reading it. A storekeeper opened his shutters, but didn't look toward the rooming house. 2 men walking past stopped talking when they noticed Amos watching from above. They moved along faster than they had been walking before. Small things. The kind that meant nothing by themselves, but everything when you added them together. Amos Fell had been traveling southern roads for 30 years. He had learned certain lessons the hard way. The loudest man in a town was rarely the most dangerous. And when a deputy left a room early to make a report, the clock started. By mid-morning, Amos walked into Hollis's saloon. The room was empty. Dust hung in the slanted light from the windows. Hollis stood behind the bar, wiping glasses that were already clean. He looked surprised to see Amos. "You're early," Hollis said. Amos nodded slightly. "Just looking around." He moved slowly through the room, not like a customer, like a man measuring something. He looked at the front doors, the way they opened inward. He looked at the bar, the height of it. He looked at the narrow side door built into the right wall. Then he stood there, studying the angle across the room. From that position, he could see everything. The stool where Malachi played, the bar, the front entrance, every man who walked through the door. He stayed there long enough to memorize it. Then he left. Back at the rooming house, Malachi was sitting on the bed with the guitar across his lap. He was playing quietly, not performing, just letting his fingers move. Amos stepped inside, closed the door, and said the words both of them had been avoiding. "Crow's coming tonight." Malachi kept playing for a moment longer. Then the music stopped. "How many?" he asked. Amos shrugged slightly. "Enough." They sat in silence. Outside, the Mississippi sun climbed higher. The heat pressed against the thin wooden walls of the building. Finally, Malachi reached down beside the bed. He pulled the case onto his lap and opened it fully. The guitar rested on the left side, secured by two worn leather straps. The right side was lined with dark cloth. Amos already knew what was there. He had seen it before, but he watched anyway. Malachi lifted the cloth. Underneath, broken neatly into two pieces, lay a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. Malachi assembled it without thinking. The movements were practiced, quiet. He checked both barrels, loaded 2 shells, then he placed the weapon back inside the case, closed the lid, and latched it. Neither man spoke for a while, because there was nothing left to discuss. Leaving town now meant riding into open roads Crow's men knew better than they did. Staying meant one thing. The fight would happen in the saloon. Evening came slowly, but when it arrived, Calico Bend was ready. The saloon filled early, too early. Men stood in groups holding drinks they barely touched. They watched the door, waiting. Garrett Hollis moved behind the bar with stiff mechanical motions. He poured whiskey after whiskey, trying to pretend the room felt normal. But the room knew. Everyone knew. Tonight, something was going to happen. The front door opened. Malachi Boon walked in, exactly the same way he had the first night. Flat brim hat, travel coat, guitar case in his hand. He crossed the room slowly, set the case beside the stool, opened the guitar side, lifted the instrument, and began to tune the strings. Near the back wall, Cora Ashen stood with a serving tray pressed against her chest. She had worked in Hollis's for 3 years. 3 years of learning how to move quietly, how to stay invisible, how to survive. But tonight, her eyes kept drifting back to the guitar case beside Malachi's boot, because she had seen what was inside it. At the side door, Amos stood exactly where he had planned to stand, back against the wall, right hand loose at his side. Malachi began to play, and somehow, even now, the music was still extraordinary. It flowed across the room like cool water in the middle of summer heat. Men who had come expecting violence found themselves standing still again, listening. For a moment, the tension softened. Then the front doors opened. Sheriff Denton Crow stepped inside. 14 men followed him, and every exit in the saloon quietly disappeared. The music stopped. Not abruptly, not in panic. Malachi finished the final note of the song and let it fade naturally into the silence. Then he placed the guitar gently on the bar, both hands visible, and turned on the stool to face Sheriff Denton Crow. The room did not move. 14 armed men stood between him and every door. Crow stepped forward slowly, boots crunching through sawdust and broken glass from earlier nights. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to see Malachi clearly, close enough to end it whenever he wanted. Crow studied him, the hat, the worn coat, the guitar case resting beside his boot, and finally the eyes, steady, calm. Crow had expected fear. Most men showed it long before a situation like this, but Malachi Boon looked patient, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Crow spoke quietly. "Show's over." The words landed in the room like a hammer. No shouting, no threats, just certainty. Malachi nodded once, slowly. Then he reached down. Not toward the guitar, toward the case. And this was the moment everything could still have stopped. Because 14 armed men watched that movement. Every one of them. They saw his hand reach for the latches. They saw the case shift slightly on the floor. And not one of them said a word. Not one of them raised a rifle. Not one of them stepped forward. Because in the mind of every man in that saloon, a black traveling musician reaching for his guitar case meant exactly one thing. He was packing up, giving up, accepting how the night was going to end. Crow allowed it. That was his mistake. Malachi's fingers found the first latch. The sound was small, but in the silence of the room, it carried. Some men would remember that sound years later, clearer than the gunshots that followed. The second latch opened. Crow leaned slightly forward, expecting to see wood, strings, the neck of a guitar sliding back into its case. Instead, he saw dark cloth, and beneath it, a shape that had absolutely nothing to do with music. For a fraction of a second, Crow's mind tried to place it, tried to force the object into the category it expected. Instrument, guitar, harmless. But the angles were wrong. Too short, too thick, too deliberate. And by the time understanding arrived, it was already too late. Malachi lifted the cloth. The sawed-off double-barrel shotgun came up with it. And suddenly the geometry of the room belonged to him. Crow's hand moved toward his pistol, but his body stopped halfway, because he understood the distance. 6 feet, 1 trigger pull, 2 barrels, 2 men dead before anyone else could react. For the first time in 30 years behind a badge, Sheriff Denton Crow hesitated. And hesitation, in a room like this, was fatal. Malachi stood, the shotgun leveled, perfectly steady. His voice when he spoke was calm enough to chill the room. "You came here to end a man's story. You picked the wrong one." The first shot came from Crow's left, one of the deputies, nerves snapping before discipline. The bullet tore through a wooden beam above Malachi's head. Splinters exploded across the bar. Malachi fired. The shotgun roared inside the closed room like thunder trapped in a box. 2 deputies went down instantly. Tables flipped. Men shouted. Glass shattered across the floor. Amos was already moving. His revolver appeared in his hand like it had always been there. 1 shot. Another deputy collapsed near the side door. Crow drew his pistol and fired. The shot smashed through the cracked mirror behind the bar. Glass rained down in a glittering storm. Hollis dropped behind the bar and stayed there. Malachi fired the second barrel. Another man fell. Then the shotgun was empty. But Malachi was already moving. He ducked behind the bar as bullets tore through the air where he had been standing. The empty shotgun swung in his hand like a club. The saloon dissolved into chaos. Smoke, shouting, overturned tables, gunfire echoing off wooden walls. And somewhere in that chaos, a blade flashed. Fast, low. It caught Malachi's left hand, the hand he played guitar with. Pain exploded through him, bright, blinding. But he didn't stop. Stopping meant dying, and Malachi Boon had not survived 6 years on southern roads by stopping. The saloon fell quiet slowly. Not peaceful, not calm, just exhausted. Gunsmoke hung in the lantern light. The smell of whiskey, blood, and burnt powder clung to every board in the room. Tables lay overturned. Glass covered the floor. 4 of Crow's men were dead. 2 more had run into the Mississippi night and had not looked back. And Sheriff Denton Crow sat slumped against his own bar, bleeding, his silver badge cracked clean in half. Amos moved through the wreckage first, careful, methodical, the way a man moves when he has done this before. He checked the doors, checked the bodies, checked the men still breathing. Then he stepped behind the bar. Malachi was there, leaning against the wood. His left hand was bleeding badly. Blood soaked through the sleeve of his shirt and dripped slowly into the sawdust. Amos took the hand gently and lifted it toward the lantern light. For the first time that night, his jaw tightened, just once. The blade had cut deep, across the palm, between 2 fingers. The kind of wound that did not just heal and disappear, the kind that changed things. Amos tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt and wrapped the hand tight. He worked quickly, quietly. Neither man spoke. They both understood what the wound meant. Malachi looked at the guitar resting on the bar. He lifted it slowly with his right hand, held it close for a moment. Then he tried to place his left hand on the neck. His fingers moved toward the strings, and the pain stopped them before they arrived. Sharp, immediate, unforgiving. A guitar player's left hand is not just a hand. It is memory. Years of calluses built in exactly the right places. Muscle memory so deep it lives beneath thought. The hand that finds a chord before the brain finishes naming it. Malachi held his fingers above the strings for a moment. Then he lowered the guitar back onto the bar and simply looked at it. He said nothing. Garrett Hollis finally rose from behind the bar, pale, shaking. His eyes moved across the room, the bodies, the broken glass. He opened his mouth to speak. Amos looked at him once, not angry, not threatening, just final. Hollis closed his mouth again. Some men spend their entire lives perfecting the art of pretending they had nothing to do with what happened in their own building. Garrett Hollis had already begun. Crow looked up from the floor as Malachi walked past him toward the door. Blood ran down the sheriff's coat. His voice was weak, but full of promise. "You won't make it far." The words carried the confidence of a man who still believed the system behind him would eventually correct this mistake. Malachi stopped. For a moment, he looked down at the sheriff. Then he continued walking. Some things do not deserve an answer. Outside, the night air hit him like cool water, and suddenly his body remembered the pain, the blood loss, the exhaustion. His legs faltered. Amos caught him before he could fall. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. They both knew the only thing that mattered now: distance. Behind them, in the doorway of the ruined saloon, Cora Ashen stood watching. 3 years she had survived in that building by being invisible. 3 years of keeping her eyes down, her voice quiet, her life small enough that nobody noticed it. Tonight, that life had ended in 4 seconds. The moment she crossed the floor, picked up the gun, and pointed it at the most powerful man in town. By morning, Calico Bend would rewrite the story. They always did. The sheriff attacked by dangerous fugitives, a violent ambush, outlaws escaping north, and the woman who had stood in the center of the room would disappear from the story entirely. Cora watched the 2 men untie the mule, watched them disappear into the darkness of the road heading north, and she understood something clearly. There was no version of tomorrow where she could stay here. Before sunrise, she packed the few things she owned, walked down the stairs, through the broken saloon, and out the front door. For the first time in 3 years. North was the only direction that made sense, so she started walking. 2 weeks later, Tennessee, a boarding house room with 1 window and fading evening light. Malachi sat with the guitar across his lap, his left hand wrapped. Healing, but not the way it used to move. He tried again. 1 chord, another. Some came, some didn't. The music that filled the room was different now, less than what he had once played, but still more than most men would ever hear in their lives. Amos listened from the doorway and said nothing about what had been lost, because what remained was still extraordinary. In 1892 Mississippi, a black man could be killed for smiling at the wrong person. The law would ignore it. The town would forget it. The story would vanish. But some stories refuse to disappear. Some survive because the people who need them refuse to let them die. And somewhere, on a road heading north, a traveling musician with a damaged hand kept playing what music he still could, and what he played was still worth stopping to hear.